The napkin landed softly on the edge of table 16, right between the breadbasket and the half-empty glass of sparkling water. Harrison Vance didn't notice it at first. He was too busy listening to the man across from him ramble on about quarterly projections and distribution timelines, numbers that should have mattered but somehow felt smaller than usual today. The Langford Hotel was one of those places where power walked through the front door and sat down without a reservation. Crystal chandeliers hung from a ceiling that was hand-painted sometime in the last century. The silverware was real silver. The napkins were cloth, pressed and folded into shapes that probably had French names, and every table was spaced far enough apart that conversations stayed private, which was exactly why Harrison preferred it. He came here once a month, sometimes twice. Always table 16. Always the corner seat facing the entrance. Old habits from a life that required him to know who was walking in before they knew he was already there. Harrison Vance was 34 years old, and he ran one of the most influential private operations in the Midwest. His name didn't show up in newspapers. It didn't trend on social media. But in certain rooms, behind certain doors, when deals worth millions needed a final handshake, his was the hand people reached for. Some called him a businessman. Others used different words. The truth sat somewhere in between, and Harrison had made peace with that a long time ago. "So if we move the timeline up by 3 weeks," the man across from him was saying, adjusting his glasses, "we can lock in the rate before—" "Hold on," Harrison said quietly. The man stopped mid-sentence. When Harrison Vance said, "Hold on," people held on. Harrison's eyes had drifted to the waitress clearing the table next to his. She was moving dishes onto a tray with practiced hands, stacking plates the way someone does when they've done it 1,000 times. Her dark hair was pulled back in a loose bun, and a few strands had slipped free, framing a face that was warm and open and striking in the kind of way that made you look twice without meaning to. She had soft curves and a full-figured silhouette, the kind of woman who carried herself with quiet grace, like she didn't realize how beautiful she was, or maybe she just didn't care about that right now. Because something was wrong. Harrison could see it in the way her fingers moved too fast, the way her jaw was tight, the way she kept glancing toward the front of the restaurant like she was counting the seconds until something terrible happened. He had spent his entire adult life reading people, reading rooms, reading the space between what someone said and what they actually meant. And right now, every signal this woman was sending screamed one word: fear. She placed the last plate on the tray, and then, without looking at him directly, she set the folded cloth napkin down on the edge of his table. Her hand lingered for just a half-second longer than it should have. Then she pulled away and walked toward the kitchen. Harrison looked at the napkin. It was folded in half, tucked neatly like the rest. Nothing unusual about it at a glance. But something about the way she had placed it there, the deliberateness of the gesture, made him reach for it. He unfolded it slowly under the table. 4 letters, written in red lipstick, slightly smudged at the edges, like she had done it in a hurry, maybe in a bathroom or behind a door with her hands shaking. Help. Harrison's chest tightened. He read the word again, then a 3rd time. The letters were uneven, pressed hard into the fabric, like the person writing them was afraid this was the only chance she'd get. He folded the napkin and slipped it into his jacket pocket. "We're done here," he told the man across from him. "What? We haven't even discussed the—" "Send it to my office. I'll look at it tomorrow." The man opened his mouth, then closed it. He gathered his papers without another word and left. Harrison stayed seated. His eyes moved to the entrance of the restaurant, where 2 men stood near the host stand. They wore tailored suits that fit a little too well for the occasion, and they weren't checking menus or waiting for a table. They were watching the room. Specifically, they were watching the path between the kitchen and the dining floor. They were waiting for her. A few minutes passed. The waitress came back out from the kitchen carrying a glass of water for another table. She set it down with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. As she turned to walk back, one of the men near the entrance stepped forward and touched her arm. He leaned close and said something Harrison couldn't hear. The color drained from her face. The second man moved to her other side, and together they began walking her toward the exit. To anyone else in the restaurant, it looked routine, maybe a family matter, maybe a phone call she needed to take. The men were calm, polite even, their hands barely touching her shoulders as they guided her out. But Harrison saw the way her steps faltered. He saw the way her eyes swept the room one last time, searching for someone, anyone, who might see what was really happening. Her gaze landed on him. It lasted maybe 2 seconds, maybe less. But in that brief moment, Harrison saw everything. He saw a woman who had reached the end of her options, who had written a single word on a napkin because she had nothing else left, and who was now being walked out of a building full of people who would never know she had been there at all. The door closed behind her. Harrison stood up. He placed $300 on the table, buttoned his jacket, and walked toward the exit. His driver, parked outside in a black sedan, straightened up when he saw his boss come through the front door faster than expected. "Car, now!" Harrison said. He didn't run. Men like Harrison Vance didn't run. But his stride covered ground fast enough that his driver barely had the engine started before Harrison was in the back seat. Through the rain-streaked windshield, he could see them. The two men were leading the waitress down the sidewalk toward the corner, where a dark SUV idled at the curb. She walked between them with her head down, her apron still tied around her waist, her shoulders drawn in like she was trying to make herself smaller. "Follow that vehicle," Harrison said. "Stay 2 cars back. Don't lose them." His driver glanced in the rearview mirror, and whatever he saw in Harrison's expression was enough. He pulled out into the rain-soaked street without a single question. Harrison leaned back against the leather seat and reached into his pocket. He pulled out the napkin and unfolded it one more time. The red letters stared back at him, already starting to blur where the rain had touched the fabric. He didn't know her name. He didn't know her story. He didn't know what kind of trouble followed her out of that restaurant and into the back of a stranger's car on a Tuesday afternoon in downtown Chicago. But he knew one thing. He had seen her eyes. And whatever was happening to this woman, she didn't deserve it. The sedan turned left, 2 cars behind the SUV, and disappeared into the gray Chicago rain. Harrison folded the napkin carefully and placed it back in his pocket. He wasn't going to let her vanish. The SUV headed south, cutting through downtown traffic and slipping past the commercial district toward the industrial stretch near the docks. Harrison's driver kept pace, 2 cars back, just close enough to track the taillights through the rain. Harrison watched the route carefully. He knew this part of the city. The warehouses down here were mostly vacant, leased on paper to shell companies that existed only in filing cabinets. It was the kind of area where things happened after business hours, and nobody asked questions in the morning. The SUV turned off the main road and rolled down a narrow street flanked by corrugated metal buildings. Puddles gathered in the broken pavement. A single streetlight flickered at the far end, casting orange light across the wet asphalt. "Pull ahead," Harrison told his driver. "Take the next left and loop around. There's a service road that connects behind these buildings. Get in front of them." His driver didn't hesitate. He had worked for Harrison long enough to know when a situation required speed over conversation. The sedan accelerated, tires cutting through standing water, and swung left down a parallel alley. They bounced over a set of railroad tracks, turned sharp right, and came out on the far side of the warehouse row, just as the SUV was slowing to a stop near a loading dock. Harrison's sedan blocked the only exit. Through the windshield, he could see the SUV's doors opening. The taller of the 2 men stepped out first, scanning the area. The second one came around from the passenger side and opened the rear door. The waitress climbed out slowly, her restaurant uniform damp from the rain, her arms wrapped around herself. The tall man grabbed her elbow and started pulling her toward a side entrance of the warehouse. She resisted, planting her feet, and he yanked harder. Harrison opened his door and stepped out into the rain. His shoes hit the wet concrete, and he straightened his jacket with one hand. He didn't rush. He walked toward them the way a man walks into a room he already owns. Shoulders square, chin level, every step deliberate. The tall man noticed him first. He let go of the waitress and turned, his hand instinctively reaching toward the inside of his jacket. "I wouldn't," Harrison said. His voice carried across the quiet loading dock, with the kind of authority that made people reconsider their choices. Harrison stopped about 15 feet away, his hands visible, his posture relaxed. But his eyes were locked onto the tall man with an intensity that said everything his words didn't. "This doesn't concern you," the second man said. He was shorter, stockier, with a thick neck and a face that looked like it had been in a few disagreements over the years. "You walked her out of the Langford. That's my restaurant, my table, my concern." The tall man studied Harrison for a long moment. Something shifted behind his eyes. Recognition, maybe, or the beginning of it. In certain circles, Harrison Vance didn't need an introduction. His reputation arrived before he did, and it usually convinced people to adjust their plans. "We're handling a private matter," the tall man said carefully. "The girl has obligations." "She has a name, I'm sure. And whatever obligations you think she has, they don't involve being dragged into a warehouse at 8 o'clock at night." The waitress stood between them, frozen. Her eyes were wide, darting between Harrison and the two men, trying to figure out if this stranger was actually going to change anything, or if he was just another problem walking into her life. Harrison shifted his attention to her for just a moment. "Come here," he said. Calm, simple, like he was holding a door open for her, and all she had to do was walk through it. She didn't move. "These men don't get to decide where you go tonight," Harrison said. "You wrote that napkin for a reason. So come here." Something cracked open in her expression. A breath she had been holding for hours finally released. She took one step toward Harrison, then another, and then she was walking fast, crossing the distance between the warehouse and the man who had actually paid attention. The stocky man stepped forward to grab her arm, and Harrison moved. One step closer, one look that landed like a closed fist. He didn't raise his hand. He didn't need to. The weight of who he was filled the space between them, and the stocky man stopped cold. "Touch her again," Harrison said quietly, "and I'll make sure the next conversation you have is with someone far less patient than me." The rain hammered the metal rooftops above them. For a long 5 seconds, nobody spoke. The tall man looked at his partner. Some kind of calculation passed between them. The kind where two people measure the cost of a fight against the cost of walking away. They chose walking away. The tall man straightened his jacket, took one last look at the waitress, and pointed a finger at her. "This isn't finished, Chloe. Mr. Bryce will hear about this." They climbed back into the SUV, reversed around Harrison's sedan, and disappeared down the service road. Harrison watched the taillights fade. Then he turned to the woman standing behind him, soaked through, trembling, still wearing her apron from the restaurant. "Chloe?" he said. She nodded. "Chloe Winslow." "Harrison Vance. Let's get you out of the rain." He walked her to the sedan and opened the rear door. She hesitated for a second, looking at him like she was searching for the catch, the hidden cost that always came attached to help from powerful men. Harrison waited without pushing. After a moment, she climbed inside. He got in beside her and told his driver to head north, away from the docks. away from whatever Chloe Winslow was running from tonight. For the first few minutes, she sat pressed against the far door, staring out the window, her fingers knotted together in her lap. The heater hummed softly, warming the car. The city lights smeared past in streaks of gold and white. "Those men," she finally said, her voice rough and tired. "They work for a man named Gordon Bryce. He was my father's business partner, his top executive." Harrison listened. "My father passed away 7 months ago. He left everything to me. The company, the estate, the trust fund, all of it. But Bryce had other ideas. He forged documents, changed the paperwork, convinced the board that my father had restructured everything before he died." She paused, pressing her palms against her knees to keep them from shaking. "He's been trying to find me for weeks. He needs my signature to finalize the transfer. Without it, there's a gap in the paperwork that someone could challenge. So he sent people to drag you to a warehouse and force you to sign. He told me if I didn't cooperate, he'd bury me in legal fees I could never afford. He said nobody would believe a waitress over a man with his connections." She let out a short, bitter laugh. "He's probably right about that part." Harrison looked at her. Under the passing streetlights, he could see the exhaustion written into every line of her face. This was a woman who had been carrying something impossible for months, alone, while the world went on around her like nothing had changed. "He's wrong," Harrison said, "and as long as you're with me, nobody is going to force you to sign anything." Chloe turned her head and looked at him for a long moment. The fear was still there, sitting right behind her eyes, but underneath it, something else surfaced. The smallest crack of relief. She faced the window again and watched the city fall away behind them as the sedan merged onto the highway heading north, leaving Chicago and Gordon Bryce somewhere in the dark below. They drove through the night. Chloe fell asleep somewhere past Rockford, her head tilted against the window, her breathing finally slow and even for what Harrison guessed was the first time in a long while. He told his driver to keep the speed steady and the radio off. Let her rest. Harrison spent the quiet hours on his phone, sending encrypted messages to his security team back in Chicago. He wanted eyes on Gordon Bryce. He wanted to know every move the man made, every call he placed, every car that left his property. By the time the sun started pushing pale light across the Illinois prairie, Harrison had a preliminary file building in his inbox. Bryce was connected, well-funded, and arrogant enough to believe that money made him untouchable. Harrison had dealt with men like that before. They always made the same mistake. They assumed that because they had gotten away with something once, the world would keep letting them. The sedan turned off the main highway around 6 in the morning and followed a winding 2-lane road through rolling hills dotted with oak trees and old stone fences. Galena sat tucked into the northwest corner of Illinois, a small town full of brick storefronts and quiet neighborhoods where people still waved at each other from their porches. Harrison's estate was 3 miles outside of town, set back behind a gated entrance lined with mature elms. The property covered 12 acres, with a main house built from local limestone, a guest cottage near the tree line, and enough privacy that a person could breathe without looking over their shoulder. The car crunched up the gravel driveway and stopped at the front steps. Harrison's housekeeper, a sturdy woman in her 60s named Margaret, was already standing at the door with a pot of coffee and the particular expression she wore whenever Harrison showed up unannounced with complications. Chloe woke up when the engine cut off. She blinked, disoriented, and looked out the window at the house and the surrounding trees and the early morning fog sitting low across the grass. "Where are we?" she asked. "Galena, about 3 hours from Chicago. This is my place. You're safe here." She looked at him, then at the house, then back at him. The question on her face was obvious. "Why are you doing this?" Harrison didn't answer it because he wasn't entirely sure himself yet. Something about the napkin. Something about the way she had looked at him across that restaurant, searching for one decent person in a room full of strangers. He had been looked at plenty of times in his life, by business partners and rivals and people who wanted something from him. But that look had been different. That look had been someone drowning and reaching for the nearest hand above the water. Margaret led Chloe upstairs to the guest room on the second floor. It had tall windows facing east, a bed with a thick quilt, and a private bathroom with towels that Margaret had already set out. Because Margaret somehow always knew. Chloe stood in the doorway for a moment, touching the doorframe with her fingertips, like she was confirming it was real. "Take as long as you need," Harrison told her from the hallway. "Breakfast whenever you're ready." She slept until almost noon. Harrison used the time to work from his study downstairs, reviewing the early intelligence on Bryce and making calls to his legal contacts. When Chloe finally came down, she had showered and changed into a set of clothes Margaret had left out for her. A simple cotton sweater and a pair of linen pants that fit well enough. Her hair was down, still slightly damp, and without the tension from last night pulling at her features, she looked different. Younger, maybe. Softer. The warmth that Harrison had first noticed at the restaurant was back in her face, and he found himself pausing mid-sentence on a phone call just to register how striking she was when she wasn't terrified. He ended the call and met her in the kitchen, where Margaret had laid out eggs, fresh bread, sliced fruit, and a pot of coffee strong enough to wake the dead, as Margaret liked to say. They sat across from each other at the kitchen island. Chloe ate slowly, like someone remembering what it felt like to sit down for a meal without watching the door. "How long were you working at the Langford?" Harrison asked. "About 4 months. I needed the income and I needed to stay invisible. Bryce had people watching my apartment, my bank accounts, my phone. I dropped everything. Got a room in a weekly rental near Chinatown. Picked up the hostess job because it paid in cash, and the manager didn't ask too many questions." "And your family? Anyone else?" Chloe shook her head. "My mother died when I was 12. It was just me and my dad after that. He built the company from nothing, spent 30 years turning it into something real. When he got sick, Bryce was the one standing closest. I think my father trusted him. I think that was the last real mistake he ever made." Harrison set his coffee down. "Tell me about the trust." Chloe took a breath. "My father set up a family trust years ago. Everything flows through it. The company shares, the real estate holdings, the investment accounts. He named me as the sole beneficiary and the successor trustee. After he died, I was supposed to step in and take control. But Bryce got there first. He had access to the company's legal team. He produced a revised version of the trust document that named him as co-trustee with full administrative authority. He claimed my father signed it 6 weeks before he died." She paused. "My father could barely hold a pen 6 weeks before he died. There's no way he signed anything." "So the revision is forged?" "I know it is, but the original document, the real one, is locked in a safety deposit box at a private bank in Milwaukee. My father told me about it before he passed. He said if anything ever went wrong, that box would have everything I needed to prove the truth." Harrison leaned back in his chair. "Then that's where we start." Chloe looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite decode. Gratitude, yes, but also something careful, guarded, like she had learned the hard way that promises from powerful men usually came with conditions.
"Harrison,"
she said, and it was the first time she had used his name.
"I have to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me."
"Go ahead."
"Why are you helping me? You don't know me. You saw a napkin on a table and followed a stranger into the rain. Men like you don't do that for free."
Harrison held her gaze. He could have given her a dozen answers. Because it was the right thing to do, because Bryce was the kind of man who needed to be stopped, because Harrison had the resources and the reach to actually make a difference. All of those things were true, but the honest answer was simpler than any of that. "Because you asked," he said. "You wrote one word on a napkin and put it on my table. That took more courage than most people show in a lifetime. and I wasn't going to sit there and finish my dinner pretending I didn't see it. Chloe held his gaze for a long moment. Then she nodded once, slowly, and something shifted between them. A wall came down, maybe just a crack, but enough. "Okay," she said. "Milwaukee." Harrison picked up his phone and started making calls. By evening, he had a secure vehicle arranged, a route mapped through back roads that avoided the main highways, and a contact at the bank who could expedite their access to the vault. Whatever Gordon Bryce had built on his lies, Harrison was going to help Chloe tear it down, one document at a time. They left Galena just after sunrise, taking a route that wound through small Wisconsin towns with names like Platteville and Dodgeville, places where the biggest concern on a Wednesday morning was whether the hardware store had the right size bolt in stock. Harrison drove this time, giving his regular driver the day off and keeping the circle tight. The fewer people who knew their movements, the better. Chloe sat in the passenger seat with a folder on her lap. She had spent the previous evening writing down everything she could remember about her father's trust, the bank where the documents were stored, the account numbers, the security protocols. Her handwriting was neat and precise, and Harrison noticed that she organized information the way someone does when they've grown up around boardrooms and legal paperwork. Waitress or not, this woman had been raised in a world of business, and it showed in the details.
"The bank is called First Continental Private,"
Chloe said as they crossed the Wisconsin state line.
"It's not a commercial bank. They handle private wealth clients, family offices, that kind of thing. My father opened the safety deposit box there about 8 years ago because he wanted the original trust documents stored outside of Illinois, away from the company's own legal infrastructure."
Smart man.
He was careful about certain things, especially toward the end, when Bryce started consolidating more control inside the company. I think my father sensed something was wrong, but he didn't want to believe it. Bryce had been with him for over 15 years.
Harrison nodded. Betrayal always cut deeper when it came from someone who had earned your trust over time. Quick enemies were easy to spot. The dangerous ones were the people who stood next to you for years, learning every lock in the house before they decided to rob it. They reached Milwaukee around 1 in the afternoon. The city spread out along the western shore of Lake Michigan, a mix of old brick and modern glass, under a sky that couldn't decide between clouds and sun. Harrison parked 3 blocks from the bank in a public garage, choosing a spot near the exit ramp where they could leave quickly if needed. First Continental Private occupied the ground floor of a limestone building on a quiet street east of the river. There was no flashy signage, no ATMs out front, nothing that invited walk-in traffic. Just a brass plate beside the door with the bank's name engraved in small letters. The kind of place that didn't advertise, because everyone who needed to know about it already did. Inside, the lobby was cool and quiet. Marble floors, dark wood paneling, a single reception desk staffed by a woman in a navy blazer who looked like she had never rushed through anything in her entire career. Chloe approached the desk and provided her identification, her father's account number, and the access credentials he had given her before he passed. The woman reviewed everything with the kind of thoroughness that justified the bank's fees, making 2 phone calls and consulting a file before finally nodding.
"Right this way, Miss Winslow."
They were escorted down a carpeted hallway to a private room adjacent to the vault. The vault itself was behind a steel door that required 2 keys turned simultaneously, one held by the bank and one held by the account holder. Chloe produced a small brass key from a chain she wore around her neck, tucked beneath her sweater. Harrison hadn't noticed it before. She had been carrying the key to her inheritance with her the entire time, even while clearing dinner plates at the Langford Hotel. The safety deposit box was long and flat, made of brushed steel. The bank associate placed it on the table and left the room, closing the door behind her. Chloe stood there for a moment, her hands resting on the lid. Harrison watched her from across the table and recognized the expression on her face. This box was the last tangible connection to her father's intentions. Whatever was inside represented the truth he had tried to protect, and opening it meant stepping fully into the fight she had been avoiding for 7 months. She lifted the lid. Inside, Neatly organized in labeled manila envelopes were the original trust documents. Harrison could see the weight of them immediately. These weren't photocopies or digital printouts. They were the originals, signed in ink, notarized with embossed seals, dated 4 years before Chloe's father died. The trust clearly named Chloe Winslow as the sole beneficiary and successor trustee. There was no mention of Gordon Bryce anywhere in the document. No co-trustee provision, no administrative authority granted to anyone outside the family. Beneath the trust papers, there was a second envelope. Chloe opened it and found a handwritten letter from her father. She read it silently, her lips pressed together, her eyes growing bright. Harrison looked away to give her the moment. Whatever that letter said belonged to her and her father alone. She folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope. When she looked up, her jaw was set and her eyes were dry.
"Everything we need is here," she said. "Every page, every signature, every notarization. Bryce's version is a complete fabrication, and these documents prove it."
Harrison nodded. "Then let's get them somewhere secure and start building the case." They placed the documents into a leather portfolio that Harrison had brought along, thanked the bank associate, and walked back through the lobby toward the front entrance. Harrison was already thinking about next steps. His attorneys could begin the filing process within 24 hours, and with the original trust in hand, Bryce's forged version would collapse under the first serious legal challenge. He pushed the front door open and held it for Chloe. She stepped through, and Harrison followed, scanning the street out of habit. That habit saved them. Across the street, parked in a gray sedan with tinted windows, 2 men sat watching the bank's entrance. One of them had a phone pressed to his ear. The other was looking directly at the front door. Harrison recognized the posture immediately. These weren't casual bystanders or parking enforcement. These were spotters, positioned here specifically to watch who came in and out of First Continental Private. Bryce had figured out the bank. Maybe he had known about it all along and was just waiting for Chloe to surface. Harrison put his hand on the small of Chloe's back and guided her to the left, away from the front steps, keeping his pace casual. "Don't look across the street," he said quietly. "We have company." Chloe stiffened but kept walking.
"Bryce's people?"
"2 of them in a gray car. They've seen us, so we can't go back to the parking garage. They'll have someone there by the time we reach it."
"Then where do we go?"
Harrison thought fast. The streets around the bank were mostly commercial, low traffic at this hour. Going on foot would make them easy to follow. Calling for a car would take too long. But 3 blocks east was the lakefront, and Harrison knew Milwaukee's harbor district from previous business dealings. Private docks, charter services, and a speedboat that belonged to an associate who owed him more than a few favors. "The marina," he said. "Stay close." They turned down a side street and cut through a service corridor between 2 office buildings. Harrison could hear footsteps behind them now, measured and deliberate, keeping distance but maintaining the trail. He led Chloe through a delivery entrance, past a loading dock, and out onto a pedestrian path that ran along the river toward the lake. The footsteps faded behind them as they put distance between the bank and the waterfront. By the time they reached the marina, Harrison had already sent a message to his contact. A sleek 30-foot speedboat was fueled and waiting at slip 14, keys in the ignition. Harrison helped Chloe aboard, untied the lines, and backed the boat out of the slip. As they cleared the harbor breakwall and hit open water, the Milwaukee skyline shrank behind them, and Lake Michigan stretched out wide and gray and endless toward the east. Chloe stood at the stern, the portfolio clutched against her chest, watching the city disappear.
"They knew about the bank," she said.
"They did, which means Bryce has been watching that box for months, waiting for you to show up."
"So what happens when they tell him we got the documents?"
Harrison pushed the throttle forward and the boat surged across the water. "Then we make sure we're somewhere he can't reach before he figures out his next move." The boat cut through the water at 40 knots, sending white spray off the bow as Milwaukee disappeared behind them. The lake was calm for October, long, shallow swells rolling in from the northeast, the kind of rhythm that rocked the hull gently once Harrison eased back on the throttle and settled into a cruising speed. He knew Lake Michigan well enough. He had crossed it twice before on business, once heading to Grand Haven and once further north to Ludington.
The lake was massive, over 300 miles long and 80 miles wide in places, and in the late afternoon light, it looked less like a lake and more like an ocean. The far shore invisible, the horizon, a flat gray line where water met sky. Their destination was the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, a remote stretch of coastline where Harrison had contacts who could provide safe harbor and ground transportation. The crossing would take several hours, which meant they would arrive after dark. That suited Harrison fine. Darkness was an old friend of his, and right now it was a better ally than daylight. Chloe sat in the cabin below deck for the first hour, holding the leather portfolio with her father's documents like it was the last thing keeping her tethered to solid ground. Harrison could hear her moving around down there, opening cabinets, running water, doing the small, ordinary things that people do when they're trying to convince themselves that everything is going to be okay. Around 6 o'clock, the sun started dropping toward the western horizon behind them, painting the water in shades of amber and copper. The wind had died down and the lake surface turned glassy, reflecting the sky like a sheet of tinted metal. Harrison cut the engine back to idle and let the boat drift. They were well past the shipping lanes now, alone on the water with nothing around them in any direction. Chloe came up from the cabin carrying 2 bottles of water she had found in the galley. She handed one to Harrison and leaned against the railing at the stern, looking out over the wake that trailed behind them in a long, white V-shape, slowly dissolving into the flat water.
I haven't been on a boat since I was 14, she said. My father used to take me sailing on Lake Geneva every summer. He had this old wooden sailboat, probably worth more in nostalgia than actual money. We'd spend whole weekends out there, just the 2 of us. He'd teach me how to read the wind, how to trim the sails, how to navigate by landmarks on the shore. She smiled, and it was the first real smile Harrison had seen from her. He said the water was the only place where the world couldn't interrupt you. Sounds like he was right about a lot of things. He was, about most things anyway. He just couldn't see what was standing right next to him in his own office. Harrison leaned against the opposite railing, giving her space, but staying close enough that the conversation felt natural. The evening air was cooling rapidly, and he could see goosebumps forming on her arms. He went below deck and came back with a wool blanket from one of the storage compartments, handing it to her without making a production out of it. She wrapped it around her shoulders and thanked him quietly. "Can I ask you something?" she said after a while. "Sure." "Back at the restaurant, when you found the napkin, you could have ignored it. You could have flagged down the manager, called someone, finished your meeting, and gone home. Most people would have. Why did you follow me yourself?" Harrison took a drink of water and thought about it. The honest answer had layers to it, and he wasn't sure which layer she was asking about. "I've sat at that table probably 40 times over the past 3 years, he said. "I've watched dozens of people come and go through that restaurant. Staff, guests, business people, tourists. And in all that time, nobody has ever asked me for help. People ask me for deals, they ask me for introductions, they ask me for leverage, but nobody asks me for help. Because in my world, asking for help means admitting you're vulnerable. And vulnerability is something people in my position aren't supposed to respond to." He paused, watching the last edge of the sun sink below the horizon. The sky turned deep purple along the waterline. "When I opened that napkin and saw that word, I realized I couldn't remember the last time someone trusted me enough to be that honest. You didn't know who I was. You didn't know what I could do. You just needed someone to see you. And you picked my table." Chloe studied his face in the fading light. "I didn't pick your table. I was clearing the one next to it. Your table was just the closest." Harrison laughed,
A real laugh, short and surprised, the kind that escapes before you can catch it.
So it was random.
Completely random. You happened to be sitting in the right place. She paused, and her expression softened. But you happened to be the right person, too. That part wasn't random. The boat rocked gently on the still water. Above them, the first stars were appearing, scattered across a sky that was shifting from purple to black.
Out here, away from the city lights, the stars looked close enough to touch, thick clusters of them stretching across the darkness, like someone had spilled sugar across a dark tablecloth. They stood there for a while without talking, watching the sky fill up. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that happens when two people have run out of small talk and arrived at something more honest underneath. "I've been scared for 7 months," Chloe said eventually. Her voice was steady, but there was a rawness in it that Harrison could feel in his chest. "Every morning I woke up in that tiny rental room and checked the locks 3 times before I could even make coffee. I memorized the exits in every building I walked into. I changed my route to work every single day. I stopped calling my friends because I was afraid Bryce would trace the numbers. I stopped going to places my father and I used to visit because I thought someone might be watching." She pulled the blanket tighter. "I've been invisible for 7 months. And the worst part is, I was starting to get used to it." Harrison looked at her. The starlight caught the edges of her face, and he could see the strength in it. The same strength that had carried her through those months alone, that had kept her standing when everything around her was designed to make her fall. "You don't have to be invisible anymore," he said. "And you don't have to run. We have the documents. We have the proof. And when this is over, you're going to walk back into that boardroom with your name on the door and your father's legacy exactly where he wanted it." Chloe turned to face him fully. The wind had pulled a strand of hair across her face, and she pushed it back with one hand. For a moment, she looked like she wanted to say something more, something that went beyond gratitude and legal strategy and trust documents. But instead, she just held his gaze and let the moment sit there between them, warm and certain and unfinished in the best possible way. "Thank you, Harrison," she said. "You can thank me when Bryce is answering questions in front of a judge." She smiled again, and this time it stayed. She leaned her shoulder against his arm, just barely, just enough to close the small distance between them, and they stood together at the stern of the boat as it drifted east across the dark water toward Michigan. Ahead of them, the far shore was still invisible, somewhere beyond the curve of the earth, waiting in the dark. Behind them, Milwaukee was already gone, and for the first time in 7 months, Chloe Winslow wasn't looking over her shoulder. They reached the Michigan coastline just past midnight. Harrison guided the boat into a small private dock near St. Ignace, where a man named Cal was waiting with a pickup truck, and no questions. Cal was one of Harrison's older contacts, a retired Marine contractor who had done work for the Vance family for over a decade. He drove them north, through empty roads lined with pine trees, to a ferry terminal that ran late-night crossings to Mackinac Island. The island sat in the straits between Michigan's upper and lower peninsulas, a place where cars were banned and people moved by horse-drawn carriage or bicycle. It was 3.5 square miles of dense forest, Victorian architecture, and the kind of quiet that made the rest of the world feel like a rumor. Harrison had stayed at the island's private timber lodge twice before, once during a particularly complicated negotiation that required distance from every major city, and once simply because he needed to think. The lodge belonged to a family trust that Harrison's father had established years ago, tucked into the trees on the island's northern shore, invisible from the main roads. The ferry crossing took 20 minutes. Chloe stood at the bow, wrapped in the wool blanket from the boat, watching the island's lights grow closer across the black water. She hadn't slept since Milwaukee, but something about her had shifted during the lake crossing. The tightness in her shoulders had loosened. Her breathing was slower. She looked tired but present, like someone who had finally stopped bracing for the next disaster. A caretaker met them at the island dock with a horse-drawn cart, which under different circumstances might have felt like something out of a storybook. He drove them along a dirt path through the woods to the lodge, a 2-story structure built from reclaimed timber and local stone, with a wide porch that overlooked a stretch of rocky shoreline. Inside, the lodge smelled like cedar and old books. A fire had already been lit in the main room, and the caretaker had stocked the kitchen with fresh supplies. There were 2 bedrooms upstairs, each with heavy quilts and windows that faced the water. Harrison showed Chloe to the larger room and told her to get some rest. "What about you?" she asked from the doorway.
I have some calls to make. My legal team needs to start reviewing the trust documents tonight so we can build a filing strategy.
Harrison, it's almost 2 in the morning.
My attorneys charge $400 an hour. For that price, they can answer the phone at 2. She gave him the look that was half amused and half concerned. The kind of look someone gives you when they realize you're the type of person who forgets that sleep is a biological requirement. Then she closed the door, and Harrison heard the bed springs creak as she finally lay down. He spent the next 3 hours in the lodge's study, a small room off the main hall, with a desk, a secure satellite phone, and a shelf full of books that nobody had touched in years. He scanned the trust documents and transmitted them to his lead attorney, a woman named Rebecca Chen, who had handled Harrison's most sensitive legal matters for the past 6 years. Rebecca was sharp, methodical, and completely unfazed by phone calls at odd hours. She reviewed the documents in real time while Harrison walked her through what Chloe had told him about Bryce's forged version.
"The originals are airtight," Rebecca said after an hour of review. "Notarization dates, witness signatures, filing references, everything checks out. If Bryce produced a revised version claiming co-trusteeship, he's going to have a very difficult time explaining why his version has none of these procedural markers. We can file a challenge within 48 hours.
Do it, Harrison said, and keep it quiet until we're ready to present. I don't want Bryce knowing we have the originals until we're standing in front of him with the full package. He hung up and sat in the dark study for a while, listening to the fire crackle in the other room and the faint sound of waves against the rocks outside. Somewhere in Chicago, Gordon Bryce was probably awake too, making his own calls, trying to figure out where Chloe had gone and what she had taken from that bank vault. The clock was ticking for both sides now. Harrison slept for a few hours on the couch in the main room and woke up to the smell of coffee. Chloe was in the kitchen, standing at the counter in the morning light, pouring 2 cups from a French press she had found in the cabinet. She looked rested for the first time since he had met her, the shadows under her eyes lighter, her movements easier, the constant alertness dialed down to something that resembled calm. "You found the good coffee," Harrison said, accepting the cup she handed him. "Your caretaker has excellent taste. There's also bacon and eggs in the fridge if you're interested. You don't have to cook. I've been a waitress for 4 months. Old habits." She smiled. "Besides, you drove all night, crossed a lake, and stayed up until dawn talking to lawyers. The least I can do is make breakfast." They ate on the porch, watching the morning light spread across the water. The straits were blue-green in the early sun, and a pair of freighters moved slowly in the distance, heading toward Lake Huron. The air was cold and clean, carrying the smell of pine and wet stone. After breakfast, they spent the day working through the legal strategy. Harrison set up a secure line in the study, and Chloe sat across from him, answering Rebecca's questions about the trust structure, the company's board composition, the timeline of her father's illness, and every interaction she had documented with Bryce since the death. Chloe was thorough and organized, recalling dates and names and details with the kind of precision that impressed even Rebecca, who was not easily impressed. Around midday, they took a break and walked along the shoreline path that circled the northern tip of the island. The trail was lined with birch trees and wild grass, and the only sounds were their footsteps on the gravel and the water lapping against the rocks below.
"My father would have loved this place," Chloe said, looking out at the water. He always talked about buying a house somewhere remote after he retired, somewhere with trees and water and no cell service. He never got the chance.
"You'll get the chance," Harrison said. "After this is settled, you can do whatever you want. Build whatever life makes sense to you."
She glanced at him sideways. "What about you? After this is settled, I mean. You go back to table 16 and wait for the next napkin?"
Harrison laughed quietly. "I don't think that's how it usually works. Napkin rescues aren't exactly a regular part of my schedule."
"Lucky me then, catching you on an off day." They walked in comfortable silence for a while, their steps falling into the same rhythm without either of them trying. At some point, Chloe's hand brushed against his, and neither of them pulled away.
It was a small thing, barely a moment, but it carried the weight of everything that had happened between them over the past 3 days. The trust built mile by mile, conversation by conversation, one honest answer at a time. When they reached the point where the trail curved back toward the lodge, Chloe stopped and turned to face him. The wind was coming off the water, pulling at her hair, and the afternoon light made her eyes look like amber. "I want you to know something," she said. "Whatever happens with Bryce, whatever happens with the company, this right here is the first time in 7 months that I felt like myself. And that's because of you." Harrison looked at her, this woman who had survived 7 months of hiding and fear and loneliness, and had somehow come through it all with her warmth still intact, her courage still standing, her ability to trust still functioning, even after the person closest to her father had burned trust to the ground.
"You did that yourself, Chloe. I just drove the car."
She shook her head slowly, but she was smiling, and the smile reached her eyes this time, all the way through. They walked back to the lodge together as the afternoon turned golden around them, and for the first time since this whole thing started, the future felt like something worth walking toward. The call came at 6 in the morning. Harrison was already awake, sitting on the porch with his coffee, watching the fog lift off the straits. His secure phone buzzed twice, and the name on the screen was one that only appeared when something had gone wrong. Dominic Reeves, Harrison's head of intelligence, a former corporate investigator who had spent 15 years tracking financial fraud before Harrison hired him away from a consulting firm in New York. "Talk to me," Harrison said. Bryce moved fast, faster than we expected. Dominic's voice was flat and precise, the way it always sounded when he was delivering bad news. "He filed an emergency petition with a private arbitration board last night. He's claiming that Chloe Winslow is mentally unfit to manage the trust and that all assets tied to her name should be frozen pending a competency review." Harrison set his coffee down. "On what grounds?" "He's arguing that she abandoned her responsibilities, disappeared without notice, and has been exhibiting erratic behavior. He's got 2 people willing to testify that she left her apartment in the middle of the night 7 months ago and hasn't been seen since. He's framing the whole thing like she had a breakdown. That's garbage, and he knows it. Of course it is, but the arbitration board doesn't know that yet. All they see is a filing from a respected executive with supporting statements. If they grant the freeze, every account with Chloe's name on it locks up. The trust, the investment accounts, even the operating funds for the company. She won't be able to touch anything, and more importantly, she won't be able to use the original trust documents to challenge his position, because the case will be stuck in arbitration for months." Harrison stood up and walked to the edge of the porch. The morning was still and beautiful, the water flat as glass. The kind of scene that belonged on a postcard. It felt completely at odds with what was happening behind the scenes.
"How long before the board rules on the freeze?"
48 hours, maybe less. Bryce is pushing for an expedited decision. He's calling in favors with the arbitration panel, and the man has plenty of favors to call in.
Can Rebecca challenge the filing?
She can, but it takes time. The challenge has to go through the same arbitration process, and Bryce knows that. He's not trying to win the competency argument. He's trying to buy time. If he can stall Chloe long enough, he can push through the company sale and distribute the assets before any court has a chance to review the original trust. Harrison processed this quietly. Bryce was smarter than he had initially given him credit for. The man wasn't fighting the evidence directly. He was attacking the timeline, creating procedural obstacles that would delay Chloe's claim until the underlying assets no longer existed in their current form.
By the time anyone untangled the arbitration, Bryce would have sold the company, pocketed his share, and buried the paper trail under layers of corporate restructuring. "There's something else," Dominic said. "Bryce is scheduled to appear at a business convention in Detroit in 2 days, the Lakeshore Industrial Summit. He's on the main stage, and according to the program, he's announcing the final sale of the company to an outside buyer. Once that sale goes through and the board ratifies it, Chloe's claim gets exponentially harder to enforce. So he's trying to freeze her out and sell the company at the same time." "Exactly. Belt and suspenders. Even if one strategy fails, the other one closes the door." Harrison ended the call and stood on the porch for a few minutes, thinking. The pieces were moving quickly now. Bryce had shifted from a man trying to keep a secret to a man trying to outrun the truth, and he was throwing everything he had at the clock. He went inside and found Chloe in the kitchen, slicing bread for toast. She looked up when she saw his expression and set the knife down.
What happened?
Harrison told her everything. He laid it out clearly: the arbitration filing, the competency claim, the asset freeze, the convention in Detroit, the planned sale announcement. He didn't soften it or dress it up. Chloe had earned the right to hear the full picture, and he respected her too much to filter it. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment, her hands resting on the countertop, her gaze fixed on some middle distance between the kitchen and the wall.
"He's going to sell my father's company," she said. "Everything my dad spent 30 years building. Bryce is going to stand on a stage and hand it to a stranger. And he's going to do it with forged documents and a fake story about me losing my mind."
"That's his plan, yes."
"Then we stop him at the convention."
Harrison studied her. He had expected anger, maybe frustration or despair. Instead, what he saw was something harder and more focused. Chloe Winslow was done being chased. The fear that had defined her life for 7 months was still there. He could see it, sitting in the tight line of her jaw, but it was no longer driving the car. Something else had taken the wheel. "If we go to Detroit," Harrison said, "we're walking into his territory. That convention will be full of people who know Bryce, who do business with Bryce, who have every reason to believe his version of events. We'll have one chance to present the original documents, and if we don't do it right, Bryce will spin it as exactly the kind of erratic behavior he described in his filing."
"So we do it right?"
"We will, but I need you to understand what that means. It means walking into a room full of people who think you're either missing or unstable, standing in front of them and proving them wrong. That takes more than just documents. That takes presence." Chloe met his eyes.
"I've spent 4 months carrying plates and clearing tables while 2 men in suits waited by the door to drag me into a car. I think I can handle a ballroom."
Harrison almost smiled. "Almost. All right, Detroit. But we're not going straight there. We need to prepare, and I know a place where we can do that properly. There's a private estate in Ann Arbor, about an hour outside of Detroit. We'll stage from there." He picked up his phone and started coordinating. He called Rebecca and told her to prepare a formal presentation of the trust documents, certified copies, notarized affidavits, a complete chain of custody that no arbitration panel could dismiss. He called Dominic and requested a full profile on every board member and legal representative who would be present at the convention. He called his logistics contact in Michigan and arranged secure transportation from Mackinac Island to the Lower Peninsula. Chloe watched him work, standing in the kitchen doorway with her arms folded. When he finally set the phone down,
She walked over and stood in front of him. Harrison,
Yeah.
when we walk into that convention, I don't want to walk in as a victim. I don't want people looking at me and seeing the waitress who got rescued. I want them to see the person my father raised me to be, the person who was supposed to lead that company. Harrison looked at her, and what he saw in that moment was exactly the woman she was describing. Steady, certain, ready. Then that's exactly who they'll see, he said. They left the island that afternoon, taking the ferry back to the mainland and driving south through Michigan's interior. The trees along the highway were turning gold and red, autumn arriving in full force, and the road stretched out ahead of them long and straight, pointing toward Detroit and the reckoning that was waiting there. The estate in Ann Arbor sat at the end of a long private drive bordered by mature oak trees whose leaves had turned deep crimson. It was a Georgian-style house, red brick with white columns, set on 4 acres of landscaped grounds with a pond at the back and a guest house near the tree line. Harrison had acquired the property 2 years ago through a business deal that had gone sideways for the previous owner. He rarely used it, but he kept it maintained and staffed because a man in his position always needed places to land that didn't appear on any public record. They arrived in the late afternoon. The house manager, a composed man named Arthur, who had worked estate properties his entire career, had everything ready. Fresh linens, a stocked kitchen, the study cleaned and set up with a secure workstation. Arthur didn't ask questions about the guest. He simply prepared the second bedroom, set out towels, and disappeared into the efficient background that good house managers occupied. Harrison spent the first hour on the phone with Rebecca Chen, going over the legal presentation piece by piece. Rebecca had worked through the night, assembling a package that could withstand any challenge Bryce might throw at it. Certified copies of the original trust document, notarized affidavits from the bank confirming the chain of custody of the safety deposit box, a forensic analysis of the signatures on Bryce's version of the trust, which Rebecca had commissioned from an independent handwriting expert. The expert's preliminary finding was exactly what they needed. The signature on Bryce's revised document showed clear signs of mechanical reproduction, meaning someone had traced or digitally replicated Chloe's father's signature rather than obtaining a genuine one.
That's the piece that breaks it open, Rebecca said. Bryce can argue about intent, about verbal agreements, about informal understandings, but he can't argue with a forensic analysis that proves the signature is fabricated. Once we present that to the board, his entire position collapses. How do we get it in front of the right people? Harrison asked.
The Lakeshore Industrial Summit has a formal program. Bryce is scheduled for the main stage at 8 o'clock tomorrow evening. He's presenting the sale as a done deal, with board ratification expected immediately after his speech. The board members, legal counsel, and the buyer's representatives will all be in the room.
So we present before he gets to the stage.
We present during. If we approach the board beforehand, Bryce will find out, and he'll either cancel his appearance or have his lawyers block the challenge before it reaches the floor. The element of surprise is our strongest advantage. We let him start his speech, let him commit to his version of events publicly, and then we walk in with the evidence. He won't have time to prepare a counter-narrative because he'll be standing on a stage in front of 300 people. Harrison liked it. It was clean, direct, and it turned Bryce's own platform into the stage for his exposure. The man wanted a spotlight. He was going to get one. After the call, Harrison went looking for Chloe and found her in the backyard, sitting on a wooden bench near the pond. She was reading through her father's handwritten letter again, the one from the safety deposit box. She folded it when she heard him approaching and slipped it into her pocket. "Rebecca's ready," Harrison said, sitting down beside her on the bench. "The legal package is solid. We go in tomorrow evening during Bryce's speech." Chloe nodded slowly, looking out at the water. A pair of ducks drifted near the far bank, unbothered by anything happening in the human world.
"I keep reading his letter," she said. "My father's. He wrote it about a year before he died, when he first started getting sick. He knew something might happen. He didn't name Bryce specifically, but he wrote about protecting the company from people who saw it as an asset instead of a legacy. He said the difference between the two was everything.
He understood what he built.
He did, and he trusted me to protect it. That's what makes all of this so heavy. It's not just the money or the company. It's that my father looked at me and believed I was the person who could carry what he started.
She paused.
I need to be that person tomorrow.
Harrison let the moment sit. Then he stood up and offered her his hand. Come with me. There's something I arranged. He led her back into the house and upstairs to a room that Arthur had prepared according to Harrison's instructions. Inside, a portable clothing rack held several garment bags, and a long table had been set up with accessories, shoes, and a lighted mirror. Standing beside the rack was a woman in her 50s with silver-streaked hair and a measuring tape draped around her neck. Her name was Diane Calloway, and she was one of the most sought-after private tailors in the Midwest. She had dressed executives, diplomats, and public figures for events where appearance was a form of currency, and she had made the 3-hour drive from Chicago that morning because when Harrison Vance called, Diane Calloway answered. Chloe stopped in the doorway, her lips parting slightly as she took in the scene. This is Diane, Harrison said. She's here to make sure that when you walk into that ballroom tomorrow, every person in the room knows exactly who you are. Diane stepped forward with a warm, professional smile and extended her hand.
Ms. Winslow, it's a pleasure. I understand we're dressing for something important.
Chloe looked at Harrison. He could see the emotion moving behind her eyes, something that went deeper than surprise. For 7 months, this woman had been shrinking herself. Smaller apartments, smaller routines, smaller clothes pulled from thrift stores and clearance racks. Anything to stay invisible. And now, someone was telling her it was time to take up space again. I'll leave you to it, Harrison said, and closed the door behind him. He spent the next 2 hours downstairs in the study, reviewing Dominic's profiles on the board members who would be present at the convention. There were 9 of them, 7 men and 2 women, each with different loyalties and motivations. 3 were firmly in Bryce's camp, having benefited directly from his management of the company over the past 7 months. 2 were neutral, primarily concerned with their own financial positions. And 4 had been close to Chloe's father and had expressed private doubts about the transition of power, though none had been willing to challenge Bryce publicly. Those 4 were the key. If Harrison and Chloe could reach them with the evidence, the board vote would swing. Rebecca's legal package would handle the factual argument. The forensic signature analysis would handle the fraud. But the emotional argument, the thing that would make 4 cautious board members stand up and do the right thing, that would come from Chloe herself. She came downstairs around 8 o'clock. Harrison was in the main room reviewing his notes when he heard her footsteps on the staircase, and he looked up. She wore a deep emerald dress that Diane had tailored to a frame over the course of the afternoon. It was elegant and structured, with clean lines that gave her a commanding silhouette. Her hair was down, styled in loose waves that framed her face. She wore simple gold earrings and a thin chain at her neck. The overall effect was striking, the kind of presence that made a room adjust itself around her. She stood at the bottom of the stairs, watching his reaction. "Well," she said. Harrison set his notes down. He had seen a lot of things in his life. He had sat across from powerful people in expensive rooms and held his ground without blinking. Very few things caught him off guard. This caught him off guard. "Bryce doesn't stand a chance," he said. Chloe smiled, and there was something new in it. Confidence. The kind that doesn't come from a dress or a tailor or a mirror, but from the decision to stop hiding and start fighting. The dress was armor, but the woman wearing it was the weapon.
Diane said I should wear heels,
Chloe said, glancing down at her feet.
I told her I've been on my feet for 4 months carrying dinner plates. Heels are nothing.
Harrison laughed. Get some rest tonight. Tomorrow's going to be a long day.
She turned to go upstairs, then paused on the third step and looked back at him. "Harrison, thank you. For the dress, for the lawyers, for everything. But mostly for treating me like I belong in this fight."
"You don't just belong in it, Chloe. You're the reason it exists." She held his gaze for a moment, then nodded and continued up the stairs. Harrison sat alone in the quiet house, listening to the October wind push against the windows. Tomorrow evening, they would walk into a room full of people who believed Gordon Bryce's version of reality. And by the time they walked out, every person in that room would know the truth. He picked up his phone and sent Rebecca one final message.
"We're ready. See you in Detroit." The Lakeshore Industrial Summit occupied the entire top floor of the Renaissance Grand Hotel in downtown Detroit. It was the kind of event that drew money from every corner of the Midwest, a gathering of executives, investors, legal firms, and board members who spent 11 months of the year competing with each other and one evening a year pretending they didn't. The ballroom alone could seat 400, and tonight it was nearly full. Harrison and Chloe arrived at 7:15, 45 minutes before Bryce was scheduled to take the stage. Harrison's driver dropped them at the side entrance, where Rebecca Chen was already waiting with a leather briefcase containing the complete legal package. She wore a charcoal suit and an expression that suggested she hadn't slept much, but was running on the kind of energy that only high-stakes litigation could produce.
"Everything's in order,"
Rebecca said, handing Harrison a printed program.
"Bryce is the keynote speaker at 8. He's planning to announce the acquisition of Winslow Industrial by Grayton Partners, a private equity firm out of Cleveland. The board members are seated at tables 6 through 9, near the front. Legal counsel for the buyer is at table 12, and Bryce's personal team has a private room on the mezzanine level where he's doing pre-speech prep."
"Security?" Harrison asked.
"Standard event staff, nothing private. Bryce didn't bring his own detail, which tells me he's feeling confident. He thinks this is a formality."
Harrison looked at Chloe. She was standing with her shoulders back, her chin level, the emerald dress catching the light from the hotel lobby's chandeliers. If she was nervous, she had buried it deep enough that even Harrison couldn't find it. The woman who had trembled while placing a napkin on his table 5 days ago was gone. In her place stood someone who looked like she had been walking into rooms like this her entire life. "Ready?" he said.
"I've been ready since Milwaukee,"
she said. They entered the ballroom through the main doors. The room was enormous, draped in dark blue and silver, with round tables arranged in concentric semicircles facing a raised stage at the far end. A podium stood center stage with the summit's logo projected on a screen behind it. Waitstaff moved between tables, carrying trays of champagne and appetizers, and the hum of conversation filled the space with the low, steady buzz of people who were comfortable with large numbers and long handshakes. Harrison walked in first, with Chloe beside him and Rebecca a half-step behind. He didn't rush, he didn't scan the room anxiously or try to blend in. He walked the way he always walked, like the room had been built around him, and everyone in it was simply filling the remaining space. Heads turned. Not all at once, but steadily, table by table, as people noticed the tall man in the dark suit moving through the crowd with a woman most of them didn't recognize, and a lawyer carrying a briefcase like it contained something that mattered. Harrison saw the recognition ripple through certain faces. Some of these people knew him by reputation. Others knew him personally from past dealings. A few looked surprised to see him here, since Harrison Vance didn't typically attend industry summits. His presence at an event like this meant something was about to happen, and the people who understood that shifted slightly in their seats. Chloe drew her own share of attention, though for entirely different reasons. She moved through the ballroom with a grace that turned heads naturally, her posture confident, her expression composed. Several of the older executives at the front tables watched her pass with the particular curiosity of people trying to place a face they felt they should recognize. A few of them would. Chloe had attended events like this as a teenager, standing beside her father, learning the rhythms of corporate gatherings long before she understood the stakes behind them.
Some of these people had shaken her hand 10 years ago and simply forgotten. They were about to remember. Harrison guided Chloe toward a standing area near the right side of the ballroom, close enough to the stage to be visible, but far enough from the front tables to avoid drawing Bryce's attention prematurely. Rebecca positioned herself near the center aisle, where she could move quickly once the moment arrived. At exactly 8 o'clock, the lights dimmed slightly, and the summit's moderator took the stage. He was a broad-shouldered man with a television voice who delivered a brief introduction about the evening's program, highlighted several corporate achievements from the past year, and then turned to the main event.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's my privilege to introduce the man behind one of this year's most significant corporate transactions. Please welcome the acting head of Winslow Industrial, Gordon Bryce. Applause filled the ballroom. From the wings of the stage, Gordon Bryce walked to the podium. He was in his late 50s, tall and lean, with silver hair combed back from a face that projected competence and authority. His suit was perfectly cut, his tie was a conservative blue, and he smiled at the audience with the ease of a man who had been rehearsing this moment for months. Chloe's hand tightened at her side. Harrison noticed and moved a half-step closer to her, his shoulder nearly touching hers. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The proximity was enough. Bryce adjusted the microphone and began speaking. His voice was polished, measured, the kind of delivery that came from years of boardroom presentations and investor calls.
Thank you all for being here tonight. It's an honor to stand before this community and share what I believe is a transformative moment for Winslow Industrial. As many of you know, the past year has been one of transition for our company. The passing of our founder, Richard Winslow, left a tremendous void, one that we have worked tirelessly to fill with the same vision and integrity that Richard embodied throughout his career. Harrison watched Chloe's face as Bryce spoke her father's name. Her jaw tightened, but she held steady. Bryce continued, walking the audience through a carefully constructed narrative about the company's evolution, the challenges of leadership transition, and the strategic decision to partner with Grayton Partners. He presented it as a natural progression, a logical next step that honored the founder's legacy while securing the company's future. Every word was calibrated. Every pause was intentional. He was selling a story, and the room was buying it.
Tonight, I am proud to announce that the acquisition agreement between Winslow Industrial and Grayton Partners has been finalized, Bryce said, his voice rising slightly. Pending formal board ratification, which we anticipate completing this evening, the transaction will close within 30 days. This represents a new chapter for a company that has been a cornerstone of Midwest industry for over 3 decades. The audience began to applaud. Board members at the front tables nodded. The buyer's legal team at table 12 exchanged satisfied glances. Harrison looked at Chloe one more time. She met his eyes, and in them he saw something clear and unshakable. She gave him the smallest nod. Harrison straightened his jacket and stepped forward into the center aisle. It was time. The applause was still rolling through the ballroom when Harrison's voice cut across it. Before the board ratifies anything tonight, there's a matter that requires their immediate attention. The clapping died in uneven patches, tables going quiet one by one as heads turned toward the tall man standing in the center aisle. Harrison didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The acoustics of the ballroom carried his words to every corner, and the authority behind them did the rest. Bryce stood at the podium, his hand still resting on his prepared notes. His expression shifted from polished confidence to something tighter as he recognized the man walking toward the stage. Harrison Vance was not a face you forgot easily, and from the way Bryce's fingers curled against the podium's edge, he hadn't forgotten it. But it was the woman walking beside Harrison who drained the color from Gordon Bryce's face. Chloe moved down the aisle with her shoulders back and her gaze fixed directly on the man who had stolen her father's company. She didn't look at the crowd. She didn't look at the board members turning in their seats or the legal teams reaching for their phones. She looked at Bryce, and she kept looking at him, until she was standing 15 feet from the stage, close enough that he could see exactly who she was and exactly what she was carrying. The room had gone completely silent. 400 people sat frozen in their seats, champagne glasses halfway to their lips, conversations abandoned mid-sentence. Nobody understood what was happening yet, but everyone understood that something had just changed. "Mr. Bryce," Harrison said, stopping at the foot of the stage, "I believe you know Chloe Winslow, daughter of Richard Winslow, sole beneficiary and successor trustee of the Winslow Family Trust." A murmur swept through the front tables. The name Winslow carried weight in this room. Several of the older executives leaned forward, and Harrison could see the recognition landing on their faces as they looked at Chloe, matching the woman in front of them with the teenage girl they had seen at events like this years ago, standing beside her father, quiet and watchful. Bryce recovered faster than Harrison expected. The man straightened at the podium and produced a thin smile that was meant to look composed, but landed closer to strained. "Chloe," Bryce said into the microphone, "this is quite a surprise. We've been deeply concerned about your well-being. No one has been able to reach you for months."
That's because you sent men to drag me out of a restaurant and force me to sign away my inheritance, Chloe said. Her voice was steady and clear, carrying across the silent ballroom without amplification. Harrison heard several sharp intakes of breath from the front tables. A woman at table 7 put her hand over her mouth.
Bryce's smile thinned further. "I think there's been a serious misunderstanding. Perhaps we should discuss this privately rather than—"
"There's nothing private about what you've done," Chloe said. "And these people deserve to hear it before they ratify a transaction built on fraud."
Harrison turned and made eye contact with Rebecca Chen, who was already moving down the side aisle toward the board members' tables. She carried the leather briefcase with the calm efficiency of someone who had walked into hostile rooms before and come out with the verdict in her favor. "Members of the board," Harrison said, projecting his voice toward tables 6 through 9. "My name is Harrison Vance. My legal counsel, Rebecca Chen, is distributing a package of documents that I'd ask you to review before proceeding with tonight's vote." Rebecca opened the briefcase and began placing bound folders in front of each board member. 9 folders, each containing a certified copy of the original trust document, the forensic handwriting analysis, notarized affidavits from First Continental Private Bank, and a side-by-side comparison of the original trust and Bryce's fabricated revision. Bryce watched the folders land on the tables like small detonations. His composure cracked another degree.
"This is completely out of order. This is a private corporate matter, and these documents have not been reviewed by our legal—"
"Your legal team reviewed your version of the trust," Chloe said, stepping forward.
"This is my father's version, the original, signed, notarized, and stored in a safety deposit box that my father established specifically because he was worried about something like this happening."
The board members were opening their folders now. Harrison watched their faces as they read. The first page alone told the story. The original trust, dated 4 years before Richard Winslow's death, clearly named Chloe as the sole beneficiary with full authority over all assets. There was no co-trustee provision, no mention of Gordon Bryce in any administrative capacity. The document was clean, unambiguous, and backed by notarization stamps and witness signatures that Bryce's version conspicuously lacked. One of the board members, a white-haired man named Callahan, who had been on the board since the company's founding, turned to the forensic analysis section and read it slowly. Then he read it again. Then he looked up at Bryce with an expression that could have frozen the lake they had crossed 2 days ago. "Gordon," Callahan said, his voice quiet but carrying, "the handwriting expert's report indicates that Richard's signature on your trust revision was digitally reproduced. It's a traced copy." Another murmur rolled through the room, louder this time. The buyer's legal team at table 12 was already huddled together, and one of them was typing rapidly on a laptop. Bryce gripped the podium with both hands. That analysis is unreliable. Anyone can hire an expert to say whatever they—
The expert was commissioned independently, Rebecca said from her position near the board tables. Dr. Leonard Strauss of the Midwestern Forensic Institute. His credentials and methodology are detailed on page 14 of your packet. He has testified in over 200 cases, and his findings have never been successfully challenged.
Callahan closed his folder and looked at the other board members. Harrison could see the shift happening in real time. The 4 members who had been privately skeptical of Bryce's takeover were sitting up straighter, their expressions hardening. The 2 neutral members were reading furiously, their neutrality evaporating with every page.
Even the 3 who had supported Bryce were glancing at each other with the particular discomfort of people realizing they had backed the wrong horse in a very public arena.
"I'd like to hear from Ms. Winslow," said a woman at table 8. Her name was Patricia Lund, and she had been one of Richard Winslow's earliest investors. She looked at Chloe with an expression that mixed recognition with something that resembled regret. "Chloe, the last time I saw you, you were 17 years old, standing next to your father at the annual shareholders' meeting. He told me that day that you were the future of his company. I should have asked more questions when you disappeared." Chloe turned to face her.
Ms. Lund, my father trusted the people at this table to protect what he built. One of those people betrayed that trust. I'm here tonight because I made a promise to my father that I wouldn't let that stand.
The room was completely still. Bryce stood alone on the stage, the spotlight that was supposed to celebrate his triumph now pinning him in place like an insect under glass. Callahan spoke again, this time addressing the full board. "I'm calling for an immediate suspension of the ratification vote, pending a full legal review of the original trust documents. Do I have a second?" "Seconded," Patricia Lund said without hesitation. "All in favor?" 7 hands went up, then 8. Then, reluctantly, the 9th. Unanimous. Bryce stared at the raised hands from the stage. The microphone was still on, picking up the sound of his breathing, which had grown shallow and audible. The room watched him the way a room watches someone who has just been caught in a lie too large to walk back from. 2 members of the hotel's event security team appeared at the side of the stage. Callahan had already made the call. They approached Bryce quietly and escorted him off the stage through a side exit, away from the cameras, away from the crowd, and into a night that was going to be very different from the one he had planned. The ballroom erupted into conversation the moment Bryce disappeared. Board members were talking to Rebecca, legal teams were making calls, journalists who had come to cover a routine acquisition were suddenly sitting on the biggest corporate fraud story of the year. But Harrison wasn't watching any of that. He was watching Chloe, who stood in the center of the ballroom, surrounded by the chaos she had just created, looking at the empty podium where the man who had stolen her life had stood moments ago. She turned to Harrison. Her eyes were bright and her hands were trembling slightly, the adrenaline finally catching up with her. "It's done," she said. Harrison nodded. "It's done." 3 days made a remarkable difference when the truth was finally on the table. Rebecca Chen filed the formal challenge to Bryce's fraudulent trust revision the morning after the gala. By noon, the arbitration board had dismissed Bryce's competency petition against Chloe, citing the overwhelming documentary evidence presented at the summit. By evening, the asset freeze was lifted, and every account tied to Chloe's name was restored to full access. Grayton Partners withdrew from the acquisition within 24 hours, their legal team issuing a terse statement about material misrepresentations in the transaction and declining further comment. Gordon Bryce hired 3 separate attorneys in the first 48 hours. None of them lasted long once they reviewed the forensic signature analysis and the certified originals from First Continental Private. The evidence was too clean, the fraud too documented, the paper trail too precise. By the 3rd day, Bryce was facing formal charges of forgery, fiduciary fraud, and corporate misrepresentation.
His personal assets were frozen, his passport flagged, and his name was appearing in every business publication in the Midwest, alongside words like indictment and criminal referral. Chloe spent those 3 days in Detroit, working from Rebecca's law office with a focus and energy that surprised everyone except Harrison. She reviewed every corporate filing Bryce had submitted during his 7 months of control, identifying irregularities and unauthorized transactions that would take forensic accountants weeks to fully unravel. She held individual phone calls with each of the 9 board members, listening to their perspectives, answering their questions, and beginning to rebuild the trust that Bryce had fractured. She was thorough, patient, and direct. And by the end of the second day, Callahan told Harrison privately that the board was more unified behind Chloe than they had been behind her father in his final years.
"She's a natural," Callahan said. "Richard would be proud."
On the morning of the 10th day since Harrison had found a napkin on his table at the Langford Hotel, Chloe signed the formal documents reinstating her as sole trustee and principal shareholder of Winslow Industrial. The signing took place in a conference room overlooking the Detroit River, with Rebecca, Callahan, and Patricia Lund present as witnesses. Chloe used her father's fountain pen, which she had carried in her bag since the day he died, and she signed her name with a hand that didn't shake at all. Afterward, she restructured the company's leadership. She appointed Callahan as chairman of a newly formed oversight board, elevated Patricia Lund to lead the audit committee, and brought in 2 independent directors recommended by Rebecca's firm to fill the seats vacated by Bryce's closest allies. She delegated the day-to-day operations to a management team she vetted personally, keeping strategic authority for herself, but stepping back from the daily grind that had consumed her father's final years. "My dad gave everything to this company," she told Harrison over coffee that afternoon. "His time, his health, his weekends, his holidays. I loved him for it, but I also watched it wear him down. I'm going to lead this company differently. I want to build something that lasts without losing everything else in the process." Harrison understood that better than most people would. They drove back to Chicago that evening, taking the same highway they had fled down 10 days earlier, except this time there was no one following them. No spotters waiting at the other end. No SUVs idling at curbs with men in tailored suits ready to intercept.
The road was just a road, and the city ahead was just a city. And the woman sitting beside Harrison was just a woman, going home for the first time in 7 months. Chloe was quiet for most of the drive. She sat in the passenger seat with the window cracked open, letting the October air rush through the car, watching the Illinois farmland flatten out toward the horizon as the sun dropped behind them. Harrison could tell she was processing. The past 10 days had compressed a lifetime of change into a space so small that it would take weeks, maybe months, to fully absorb it all. They reached Chicago around 9 o'clock. The skyline appeared gradually, first as a distant glow against the low clouds, then as individual towers of light rising above the lakefront. Harrison took the Lakeshore Drive exit and followed the curve of the shoreline into downtown, passing the familiar landmarks that had formed the backdrop of both their lives in different ways.
He parked at his building on Michigan Avenue, a high-rise that overlooked Grant Park and the lake beyond. His apartment occupied the top 2 floors, and the balcony on the upper level offered a panoramic view of the city that stretched from the Navy Pier Ferris wheel in the north to the industrial flats in the south. They took the elevator up in comfortable silence. Inside the apartment, Harrison poured 2 glasses of sparkling water and carried them out to the balcony. The night air was cool and sharp, carrying the faint sounds of traffic and distant music from somewhere along the riverfront. Chloe stepped out onto the balcony and stood at the railing, looking south. Somewhere down there, about 20 blocks away, the Langford Hotel was serving its evening guests. Table 16 was probably occupied by some executive finishing a late dinner, unaware that 10 days ago, a woman had written a single word on a napkin at that exact spot and changed the course of 2 lives.
"I keep thinking about that napkin,"
Chloe said, as if reading his thoughts.
"I almost didn't do it. I was clearing the table next to yours, and I had the napkin in my hand, and I thought, what's the point? He's a stranger. He's going to look at it and think I'm crazy. Or he's going to ignore it. or he's going to call the manager and make it someone else's problem.
What made you do it?
She turned the water glass slowly in her hands. Your hands. You were sitting there listening to that man across from you talk about numbers, and your hands were completely still on the table. No fidgeting, no drumming, no checking your phone, just still. My father used to say that you can tell everything about a person by what they do with their hands when they think nobody's watching. Nervous people move, dishonest people hide them. But someone who sits still like that, someone who's that comfortable in their own presence,
That's someone who pays attention. She looked at him.
I needed someone who was paying attention.
Harrison leaned against the railing beside her. The city spread out below them, millions of lights burning in millions of windows, each one a life being lived by someone who would never know what had happened at table 16 on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. What happens now? He asked. Chloe set her glass on the railing and turned to face him fully. The city lights caught the gold in her earrings and the green of her dress, and her face held an expression that Harrison had watched evolve over the past 10 days, from terror to trust to something that felt a lot like the beginning of everything.
Now I stop running, she said.
I have my father's company back. I have people I trust on the board. I have a legal team that could probably argue a parking ticket into a landmark case. The one thing I don't have figured out yet is what happens with you.
What do you mean?
I mean, you saved my life, Harrison. You followed a stranger into the rain, drove through the night, crossed a lake, and walked into a ballroom full of people who didn't know my name. You did all of that because I wrote 4 letters on a napkin. So now I need to know, what happens when the rescue is over? Do you go back to your corner table and your quarterly projections? Do I send you a thank you card at Christmas? Harrison looked at her. He thought about the first time he had seen her face, across a crowded restaurant, clearing dishes with trembling hands. He thought about the boat crossing on Lake Michigan, the stars reflected in the flat water, her shoulder leaning against his arm.
He thought about the shoreline on Mackinac Island, her hand brushing against his, neither of them pulling away. And he thought about the way she had stood in that ballroom in Detroit, facing down the man who had taken everything from her, and never once looking back to make sure Harrison was still there. She had known. She had trusted it completely. I'm not going anywhere, Chloe. She studied his face for a long moment, the way she had studied it that first night in the car, searching for the catch, the hidden cost. But this time she didn't find one, because there wasn't one. Good, she said, because I'm not either. She stepped closer, and Harrison put his arm around her, and they stood together on the balcony above the city where everything had started. Below them, Chicago hummed and glowed and carried on the way cities do, indifferent to the small miracles happening in its high places. Somewhere down there, a waitress at the Langford Hotel was clearing table 16, folding cloth napkins into neat shapes, unaware that the woman who had worked beside her a week ago was standing on a balcony 20 blocks north, looking out at the same skyline, finally home. The wind came off the lake and moved through the city, and Harrison held Chloe a little closer, and neither of them said anything else for a while. They didn't need to. The story had already been written. It started with 4 letters on a napkin and ended here, on a balcony above the lights, with 2 people who had found something worth keeping in the most unlikely place imaginable. And that was enough.